This week, the war that President Putin expected to last just 3 days reaches a year in duration. Russian forces have killed thousands of Ukrainians. 18 million Ukrainians have left their homes. Thousands have been forcibly deported to Russia. Historic cities now lie in ruins. Russia has targeted hospitals, schools, and energy supplies. And because of Russia's blockade of Black Sea ports and its economic blackmail, some of the world's poorest people are now paying higher prices for food, for energy, and for the means of survival. In the areas liberated from Russian forces, the Ukrainians have uncovered mass graves, as well as evidence of rape and torture on an unimaginable scale. Putin is responsible for this. His invasion was unprovoked and it was illegal. He could stop it at once by withdrawing his forces from Ukrainian land. But he is making the lives of millions of people hell for the sake of his imperial delusions. He blundered into a war that he cannot and will not win. Ukrainians were always going to resist a hostile attack aimed at wiping out their country. Early last year, in New York, I predicted that if Putin were foolish enough to invade Ukraine, that Ukrainians would defend their homeland ferociously, and I've been vindicated in that prediction. Today, they are more unified, more proud, more determined than ever. And as President Zelensky said when he addressed my honourable and right honourable friends and those across the House here in Westminster Hall on the 8th of February, freedom will win. We and the whole world remain united and resolute in our support for Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. And for the defence of the UN Charter, I will give way.
How resolute are we? Are we going to give them aeroplanes?
I can assure my honourable friend, and I will make reference to this later on in my remarks, that the determination of the Ukrainian people is unbounded. And I will talk about what further support we might give them later on in my speech. The UK and Ukraine stand side by side in the face of this aggression. We have become the closest of friends and the most committed of partners. We are inspired by their heroism and the resilience of the Ukrainian people. We come together as never before. We share a common purpose. I will.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way on that point. And I'm struck when I go out a year on about, in my constituency, the support from the British people, despite the adversity that they face with the cost of living pressures going up, that they still think this is the right thing to do. Does the Secretary of State agree with me?
The British people in every corner of the United Kingdom have demonstrated a generosity of spirit which is admirable, which should make every single member of this House proud. Ukraine's heroic armed forces have already recaptured thousands of square miles from the Russians, driving them out of more than half of all the territory that they grabbed last year. But Putin shows no sign of withdrawing his forces. If we are to change his mind, Ukraine will need to take more land back. Today, the Russian army is on the defensive. Morale is pitiful. Casualties are immense, and their troops are running out of key weapons and ammunition. So this is exactly the right moment for Ukraine to seize the advantages. That is why we and our allies must step up our effort to ensure that Ukraine wins this war and secures a lasting peace. Justice must be served on those responsible for war crimes and atrocities in accordance with international law. Please.
The Secretary has made an outstanding start in this debate. Last week, the Vice President of the United States said that the United States has formally determined that Russia has committed crimes against humanity. Has Her Majesty's government now come formally to the same conclusion?
We, of course, are looking very closely at the evidence which is being compiled. And whilst we've not made a formal designation, I can assure him and other honourable and right honourable members from across this House that we will ensure those people who are accountable, so those people who are responsible for atrocities, whether they be in the field or right up to the desk of Vladimir Putin himself, will be held accountable.
I thank the Foreign Secretary and thank the fact that the government has moved to freeze the assets of those Russians engaged in supporting the Putin regime. But the EU has already set out a plan of how they're going to move those frozen assets into a rebuilding programme for Ukraine. And our good friend and allies, the Canadians, have also set out in legislation how they will be doing that. So what's causing the delay with respect to the UK? Why have we dithered while others have acted?
The honourable gentleman is mistaken in his assessment of how far forward other countries are in this. Of course, we are all looking at ensuring, I'll make reference to this further on in the speech, we are all looking at how we can ensure that the people responsible for this damage ultimately pay for this damage. But the facts are he is wrong in terms of how far forward other nations are. With regard to Canada, I discussed this on my recent visit to Canada with Foreign Minister Joly. We have a similar legal system, and they are testing the legal parameters, and we will, of course, learn from the experience that they have. The honourable gentleman, then I'll make some more progress.
Thank the Minister very much for his response, and it's a good, positive, hard response, and we expect that, and thank him for that. It seems that reports are filtering through in relation to the systematic rape, abuse and sexual attacks upon women of all ages, from as young as 4 to as old as 83. It's systematic. It's approved at the top of government within Russia and within the troops. When it comes to taking action and collating all the evidence to ensure that those who perpetrated these acts, these depraved and evil acts, are made accountable, I am sure the Minister will give us the assurance that this House needs, but I think we need it as a nation as well. Thank you.
The honourable gentleman makes an incredibly important point, and again, I'll make reference to it later on in my remarks. But when I visited Kyiv and Irpin and spoke with the Ukrainians, and when I also spoke with the Ukrainians at our Preventing Sexual Violence conference here in London, the testimonies that I heard were genuinely heartbreaking, and I can assure him and the House that they will not go unpunished.
Friend, give way. I thank my right honourable friend. We are seeing atrocities, as has been said by other members, in Ukraine. Terrible atrocities that really, in retrospect, when this whole awful situation that Ukraine are in, may be classified as a genocide. This isn't the first time that Russia have undertaken a genocide. It happened with the Holodomor in 1932-33, but we, as a country, don't recognise it. I hope that when this is over, as soon as possible, we can look again and reclassify the Holodomor, which murdered millions of people, as this one is doing, and recognise it formally, as many other countries do.
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point, and when I gave short press comments after my meeting with Foreign Minister Kuleba in Kyiv, I made reference to that very point. Obviously, it would be wrong to prejudge how this is defined in the future, but we know, because we've heard Vladimir Putin say it himself, that his intention is to eradicate the whole concept of Ukraine. Let me make some more progress. Let me make some more progress, because a number of the interventions have touched upon things that I am planning to make in the speech. But I assure my right honourable friend I will give him the opportunity to. Increased military support to Ukraine is the quickest and therefore the most humane way to end this war. I witnessed the extraordinary courage and resolve of the Ukrainian people when I travelled to Kyiv and Irpin 3 months ago. I saw for myself, and I understand fully, that they will defend themselves and their land, whatever the cost may be. They will never give in. They will never surrender. So Russia's untrained conscripts, sent to the front line of a war that makes no sense to them, will never be able to match Ukraine's martial spirit. This is why Ukraine is going to win. And this is why we must ensure that they win as quickly as possible. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the UK's military, humanitarian and economic support to Ukraine since the invasion started has reached nearly £4 billion. I want to pay tribute and commend my right honourable friends, the members for Uxbridge and South Ruislip and South West Norfolk, for the decisiveness and the resolve in the early stages of this conflict, which gave the Ukrainians a fighting chance, enabled them to defend their capital city and bought them the time that they needed to push back the Russian forces. And I'm very glad that the Right Honourable Gentleman and the Right Honourable Lady are in their places here. We are proud to be the largest supplier of military aid to Ukraine after the United States of America. We were the first country to provide the weapons Ukraine needed to defend itself. In 2023, we shall, at very least, match the £2.3 billion of military aid we gave last year, and we shall add more advanced capabilities across land, across sea and across air.
I'm most grateful to my right friend. He referred to the importance of holding Russia to account for its crimes. He will be aware of the actions already underway, both in the International Criminal Court and by the Ukrainian judicial system. But can he confirm that the government also now support the establishment of a special international tribunal to pursue Russia for the crime of aggression?
The Right Honourable Gentleman makes a very, very important point. We have joined a working group to look at a special vehicle for a full accountability, because, as I've said in response to an intervention that was already made, it is not enough just to hold to account the people committing the rapes and the murder and the brutality. We must ensure that those ordering them to do so and facilitating that brutality are also held to account. My right honourable friend
for giving way, and he is quite right to commend the heroism of the Ukrainian armed forces, which has been second to none. Our military aid is therefore absolutely paramount, and we are right to give it. There is clearly a continent-wide challenge which embraces all of NATO around our ammunition supplies and our ability to sustain the war effort in Ukraine in the way that's going to be required. Can he commit that we are reassessing as a matter of urgency our defence stocks, which must be severely depleted at this juncture, to make sure we can sustain the effort however long it takes?
My right honourable friend is right. We need to support the Ukrainians until they are victorious. And the point I've made on the international stage, and I made this point at the Munich Security Conference just at the tail end of last week and over the weekend, these equipments, this ammunition, was to fight in this theatre against that enemy. We are lucky that the young men and young women who are conducting that fight are Ukrainians rather than British. But therefore we have an enhanced duty to ensure that they are successful. And if anyone in the international community or amongst our allies was thinking of holding back their stocks for a rainy day, this is the rainy day. I'll keep on.
Thank you, Secretary of State. And leading on to that, Biden has been given $500 million pledged further for weapons. We've given $2.3 billion from there. What message do we have for our European colleagues and those across the world to help support us to come forward and make sure Ukraine is successful?
Well, I had this conversation with NATO allies and others, and this is about not just ensuring that Ukraine can defend its sovereignty and territory and people. This is, and I'll make this point later on in my remarks, this is about defending the UN Charter and the international order that has kept us safe since the end of the last war, and that all countries that believe in defending those principles should make every effort to assist Ukraine in this time. I will make some further progress, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We will give the Ukrainian forces the upper hand on the battlefield so that they can reverse Russia's gains and limit Putin's ability to target civilian infrastructure. We must also develop their force structures and capability so that they can build a deterrence force for the future. Over the last 6 months, we have trained 10,000 Ukrainian troops to bring them up to battle readiness, and we will upskill a further 20,000 this year. And as my right honourable friend the Prime Minister announced last week, we will train Ukrainian fast jet pilots and Marines as part of a long-term investment in their military capabilities. When the Prime Minister let me make some more progress. When the Prime Minister and President Zelensky met earlier this month, they underscored our joint determination to achieve a just and sustainable peace. And we shall work together in international organisations to achieve that and to defend the principles of the UN Charter. I am travelling to New York this week to speak on Ukraine in the UN Security Council. I will tell the truth about Putin's brutality and Ukraine's heroism, but we must also increase our efforts with partners to tackle the steady drip of poisonous Russian propaganda and lies, and we will work together to help Ukrainian grain reach world markets. The Black Sea Grain Initiative and grain from Ukraine boost food security for the world's most vulnerable people. I will, and then...
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for allowing me to intervene. On the subject of training pilots, the aircraft that we have, the Lightning and the Typhoon, are totally incompatible with fighting in Ukraine. They require large sustainment and they operate from bases well away from actually in theatre. The aircraft that would be ideal, perhaps, is the Gripen aircraft, which the Swedes have. We don't have people trained to be able to train the trainers because we don't have aircraft on which to train them or simulators to do it. So I was slightly concerned when my right honourable friend says we're going to train pilots, because I wonder how we'll do it.
As my honourable and gallant friend knows, I'm a good old-fashioned thick-steamed gunner. So I understand ballistic artillery and very little else. But I'm assured by my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, in close coordination with our Ukrainian friends, that the training contribution that we are making is genuinely valuable and very much valued by them.
Secretary of State for giving way. It's said that war is easy, it's peace that's hard, but that ignores the fact that war is never easy and that peace is a light that we must all attempt to pursue to avoid an escalation of hostilities. He'll be aware that of the crucial nature of the Black Sea grain deal and the impact that the devastation from the earthquake in Turkey and Syria will have on our ability to maintain that. Can you tell us what support has been offered to Turkey and what the UN is doing to secure the position of food supplies to the rest of the world?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, he does make an important point. It's not directly linked to the subject of the debate, but I can reassure him that I've been in regular contact with the Turkish Foreign Minister with regard to our ongoing support to Turkey and northwest Syria in their attempts to deal with the terrible consequences of the earthquake. At the time I made a statement, I committed to keep the House informed. I'll make sure I do that. I think I'm looking at the number of people in the chamber. I'm going to try and make a bit more progress before I do so. In addition to our £2.3 billion of military support, we are providing more than £1.6 billion in non-military assistance. some $1.35 billion in lending guarantees through the World Bank and the EBRD, $100 million in direct budgetary assistance, and £220 million of humanitarian support. I'm going to make some more progress. I can see there are a number of people in the chamber, but I have no doubt they'll want to speak. Let me make progress, otherwise I'll get another missive from.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Talking about gunnery, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Ukrainians are managing to maintain barrages of between 5,000 and 6,000 shells and rockets per day. And they're getting probably 20,000 in from the Russians. That is equivalent to a small NATO country's procurement before the annual procurement before the war started. So is he confident that we have the industrial capacity, us and the Americans, not only to maintain the level of support and increase it to the Ukrainians, but without diminishing our own stocks, which are getting dangerously low?
The simple truth is that we have to make sure that we provide the Ukrainians with the ammunition they need to get the job done. Our industrial base will have to step up a gear, I have no doubt, but we should be confident that as NATO allies, including, of course, the industrial might of the United States of America, will considerably outmatch the capability of the Russian Federation to produce ammunition. I will make progress. I give House notice I intend to make progress now. Our vital humanitarian assistance delivered through the United Nations, Red Cross and NGOs is saving lives and helping to protect the most vulnerable in Ukraine and those forced to flee from Russian attacks. Ongoing attacks on civilian infrastructure underscores Putin's increasing desperation, and we have provided £22 million in direct support to Ukraine's energy sector. This includes £7 million for over 850 generators to ensure vital facilities like hospitals have power. I'm going to make progress. And £5 million for safety and security equipment for the civil nuclear sector. We're working closely with international partners to reduce their energy dependence on Russia. The UK phased out Russian coal from August of last year and banned imports of Russian liquefied natural gas from the start of this year. And, alongside the G7 and Australia, in December, we set a price cap on seaborne Russian crude oil to restrict Putin's primary source of revenue for his illegal war. Despite elevated oil prices, Russia's finance ministry has reported a $47 billion deficit in 2022 because of the decisive action that we have taken. And we will continue to work with partners to cut off Russia's hydrocarbon revenues and accelerate the global transition to clean, reliable sources of power. And we've also imposed our largest and most severe package of sanctions ever against Russia. With our allies, we have frozen over £275 billion worth of Russian assets, in addition to the 1,200 individuals already sanctioned. We will introduce new measures against those in Russia and outside it who are supporting or profiteering from this war. And we will crack down ruthlessly on those who seek to evade sanctions. Abuses and violations of human rights have been committed by Russian forces on a systematic scale. Torture and killing of civilians, rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war, forced deportations. We will not allow these crimes to go unpunished. We will support the war crimes investigations both of the Ukrainian authorities and the International Criminal Court. And the UK will host a major international meeting to support the ICC investigating alleged war crimes in Ukraine in March of this year. When this war is over, Ukraine can never again be left vulnerable to attack. A strong Ukraine must be safe, flourishing and prosperous. With our Ukrainian friends, we will co-host the 2023 Ukraine Recovery Conference on the 21st, 22nd of June here in London. Together, we plan to mobilise the combined might of public and private finance to ensure that Ukraine gets the vital reconstruction investment that it needs. And I know this House will join me in calling upon Putin to withdraw Russian forces from Ukrainian territory and immediately bring an end to the barbaric attacks against civilians. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Ukrainians have endured months of relentless attacks and bombardment, but their spirit is unbroken. And we share their determination that Putin's illegal attempted invasion will fail, and that this House demands that justice be done.
The question is that this House has considered the situation in Ukraine. Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, 1 year ago we gathered in this chamber fearing the worst. I had, alongside the Shadow Defence Secretary, just returned from Kyiv. Russian forces were massed on Ukraine's border. The intelligence picture was bleak. The spectre of tanks rolling across the borders of 21st century Europe seemed both inconceivable and yet imminent. On the 24th of February 2022, that was a dark day for Europe. That morning, President Putin launched the largest conflict on our continent since the Second World War, an illegal, unprovoked and unjustifiable war of choice that has left tens of thousands dead, millions displaced from their homes, billions worth of damage inflicted on Ukraine's infrastructure, families torn apart, landmines strewn across where there were once golden fields, and a dark trail of atrocities pockmarking the Ukrainian countryside. Putin believed this would be a short war. He thought it would be an easy war. He thought Ukraine would fold without a fight. Perhaps in his warped worldview, because he thought these Russian invaders would be welcomed as liberators. He thought the West was weak and divided. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, he was wrong on every count. Instead, Putin's folly has been met with unity and strength. Ukrainians have paid a bitter price for this war, but they have defended their land with courage, ingenuity, and that relentless commitment that comes from a righteous cause. Russia stands isolated and condemned on the international stage, its economy hamstrung by severe sanctions. NATO, rather than weakened, has been strengthened and invigorated, with new members posed to join. The transatlantic alliance has stayed united, and this House too has stood united. That was the message that President Zelensky received when he visited Westminster. It was a message that Keir Starmer took to Kyiv personally last week. Britain stands united behind Ukraine. And in that spirit, I want to pay tribute to the Foreign Secretary and to the Defence Secretary and to our two former Prime Ministers, who deserve credit for the roles that they have played. On Britain's military help to Ukraine and on reinforcing NATO allies, the government has had and will continue to have Labour's fullest support.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. It's a pertinent debate to have because the Leader of Opposition wasn't the only Member of Parliament who was in Ukraine last week. Myself was there. I took 112 generators to the people of Ukraine along with 6 other constituents. We have worked tirelessly since December to raise nearly £40,000 to take aid there. There was a bomb the night that we were in Lviv. Luckily, we were all safe, and on our return journey, we took a little girl, her mother, and their pet back to the United Kingdom to a host family in Guildford because they had their home destroyed. Well, I'd say to the honourable member, this government has done an awful lot of work to help the people of Ukraine, but will he also pay a tribute to everyday men and women throughout the entire United Kingdom, including my constituents, who have literally given up their day jobs to raise money and take humanitarian aid to the people of Ukraine, who they stand shoulder to shoulder. And I can say now, the people we met, the aid agency, absolutely the resolve and the bravery of those people I met is unshakable.
Well, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right. In sometimes fractious times in our country, the spirit of the British people, their generosity, has known no bounds. Their compassion is humbling, and their desire to continue to stand steadfast alongside the Ukrainian people really is a tribute to our nation. We can also all be proud of the role our armed forces are playing in training Ukrainian forces. We can be proud of the contribution of our diplomats and our brilliant ambassador, Melinda Simmons, on the ground in Kyiv. And we can be proud of the way British families, as has been said, have opened their homes to Ukrainians fleeing war and supported their cause from home. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Putin's war in Ukraine marks the end of the post-Cold War era, and we need a new mindset for these challenging times. The last year has illustrated some pretty hard lessons. First, it's laid bare how naive and complacent we've been in terms of Russian malign intent in this country and others. The invasion exposed a decade of chronic inaction against dirty money from Russia and other authoritarian states that saw Kremlin-linked oligarchs and kleptocrats use London as both the hiding place and service industry for their ill-gotten gains. It should never have taken the invasion of Ukraine to act, and while some progress has been made, the job is far from done. Labour will continue to hold the government to account until Britain is no longer a soft touch for illicit finance. Second, as the Defence Secretary himself conceded, for a decade we have hollowed out and underfunded our armed forces. Many in Europe believe the era of wars between states was over. We reshaped our security, defence, intelligence and diplomacy to tackle different threats, allowing core capabilities to dwindle. Even when Putin broke international law and invaded his neighbours, our responses were weak. That must change, beginning with the immediate need for stockpiles strategies to sustain support for Ukraine and rearm Britain. Third, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we must never... Of course I'll give way.
Very grateful as somebody not alone who has called on both front benches for a very long time to commit to 3% of GDP to be spent on defence, a figure that we were still spending in the mid-1990s after the end of the Cold War. I'm very used to hearing people, when they're not in a position, saying we need to spend more. Can we have an assurance that if he ever were in a position of power, we would reach 3% of GDP as a minimum on defence?
Well, I'm very grateful to the chair of the Intelligence Select Committee for all that he has said on this issue over many years. We have committed in my party to a defence review on day one if we were to come to office, and I gently remind him that throughout our previous period in office, spending on defence per capita was higher than it's been today. It was standing at 2.5% when we left office. We are seeing what is happening across the European continent, with so many European countries committed to spending more and committed to spending the 3% that he is indicating. We must play our part alongside France as 50% of Europe's defence capability.
I thank my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, for giving way, and indeed he will be aware of reports of Russian attempts to subvert Moldovan democracy and interfere within their political institutions, which could have far-reaching consequences for the war in Ukraine and broader European security. Does he agree with me that the UK government must act urgently to support Moldova and its democracy before the situation worsens?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the issue of Moldova and its vulnerability at this time, and I fully suspect other members to return to this issue across the course of this debate. They are feeling very worried on this year later since the war began, and we must stand with them as well. And my honourable friend's right also to refer to the cyber terrorism that has become a benchmark of Putin's aggression alongside it. Third, Mr Deputy Speaker, we must never again allow ourselves to become dependent on autocrats and their fossil fuels for our energy. Decarbonisation is now a vital national security imperative. The faster we can transition to clean power, the quicker we can undermine Putin's war effort. Every solar power panel is a shield to Putin's aggression. Every wind farm a defence against dependency, and in developing our homegrown energy systems, we can build the green jobs and the transformational industry of the future. Fourth, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's a reminder of the essential relationship with our European allies. We have shared interests, shared geography, and common values with our neighbours in Europe. NATO will always be the anchor of our defence and the cornerstone of European security. But it's more important than ever that we have strong diplomatic partnerships with our European allies and that we have a close cooperative relationship with the EU itself. This is too serious a time to be starting unnecessary fights or engaging in petty diplomatic squabbles. Mr Deputy Speaker, as we approach the one-year anniversary of this war, it's obvious that we're entering a new and dangerous phase. Last week, NATO and Western intelligence agencies warned that Putin had started amassing fighter jets and helicopters near the Ukrainian border, a sign that as we enter spring, Putin is adopting a new approach to the war, which could see greater use of Russian air power to support its faltering land offensive. But in recent days, both Ukrainian and NATO officials have warned of ammunition shortages, dwindling domestic stockpiles, and supply chains under increased pressure. If Ukraine is going to prevail over what Putin will throw at it, the UK and our allies should set aside individual announcements and instead lay out a long-term strategy to provide the support that Ukraine needs, whether it be ammunition, additional air defence capabilities or NATO standard weaponry. We need to ensure that Ukraine has our total support to tackle the Russian threat from air and land. And alongside this military assistance, we need a new diplomatic drive to sustain and broaden the diplomatic coalition against this war. Russia's invasion was an attack not just on Ukraine, but on the international order itself. It's perhaps the most egregious violation of the UN Charter since it was written. A sovereign UN member invaded by a permanent member of the Security Council. We need to work with Ukraine and partners around the world to make clear the truth of this war and counter Putin's propaganda. To make clear it is Russia that has chosen this war, that Russia is the aggressor, and that it's Russia who is willing to use global hunger as a bargaining chip, that it's Russia that's trying to change international borders through force, and that we will be less secure if that aggression is allowed to succeed. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, our support for Ukraine must entail action at home as well as abroad. At home here in the UK, we must complete the job and get our own house in order. That means tackling Putin's kleptocracy. It means closing the loopholes that continue to exist in our sanctions regime. It means properly enforcing our own laws around illicit finance. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, we will go still further. Russian rockets and Iranian drones have destroyed Ukraine's hospitals, energy plants and homes, whole villages and towns and cities to dust, reduced to rubble and ruin. By some estimates, the damage to infrastructure is more than 100 billion. Without proper funding, the essential task of rebuilding Ukraine will take decades to complete. As long ago as July 2022, the then Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk, said that the government supported using frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine. But since then, we've heard nothing. Sure, Right Honourable Lady will refer to that in her speech later. The EU has already set out a plan to shift frozen assets into a fund to help rebuild Ukraine, and Canada, as has been said, has already legislated to do it. So why hasn't our government done the same? Mr Deputy Speaker, Ukrainians don't have the luxury of time. This is an urgent point, and so I ask the Foreign Secretary once more, what steps has his government taken since July 2022 to ensure that seized Russian state assets can be used for the benefit of Ukraine? Further to this, will the government support the bill put forward by my Right Honourable friend, the member for Rhondda, which would allow for Russian state assets to be used for this same purpose? And, Mr Deputy Speaker, throughout the horrific last 12 months, the body of evidence of Russian war crimes in Ukraine has grown and grown. On a weekly basis, we hear horrific reports of mass graves discovered in liberated areas. On the TV, we see sickening videos of schools, hospitals and churches being bombed to destruction, of innocent civilians murdered and tortured. These crimes demand accountability and they demand justice. We strongly support all international efforts to document, investigate and prosecute these crimes. But again, we believe we should go further. Since March, Labour has been calling on the government to support the creation of a special tribunal to prosecute Putin and his top brass for the crime of aggression. The Foreign Secretary knows that while the ICC can investigate war crimes committed in Ukraine, it cannot investigate Russia for the crime of aggression. Only a special tribunal working alongside the ICC could ensure this gap of accountability is bridged. The Ukrainian people want this tribunal. Zelensky wants this tribunal. The EU Commission wants this tribunal, along with France, Germany, Estonia, Latvia and countless more who have called for it. So will the Foreign Secretary commit to its creation? And if so, what steps has he taken to make it happen? And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated more clearly than ever before how our security is connected with the security of the rest of Europe. The past 12 months have shown vividly that all that can be achieved when we stand united with our allies on the other side of the Channel.
Will you give way on that point?
Of course I'll give way.
I'm grateful to my friend who's made a brilliant speech this afternoon. Was he as surprised as I was that there was so little mention of this kind of threat in the integrated review? And would he support the call that the next iteration of that integrated review has absolutely got to put the recontainment of Russia centre stage?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right and has been crystal clear on this from the backbenches. We await that independent review. This has got to be central. We've got to get it right. And obviously we'll scrutinise it in every detail. In many of the areas that have been critical to supporting Ukraine defend herself against Russia, sanctions, energy security and defence, our cooperation with the European Union has been critical to our support for Ukraine and through that Ukraine's survival. I'll just make a little progress. It's more important than ever that we have strong, structured mechanisms for dialogue and cooperation with our allies in Europe, And that is why Labour have proposed a new UK-EU security pact that could cover deeper cooperation on both foreign policy, defence and security and law enforcement. Mr Deputy Speaker, Labour's commitment to NATO is unshakable, yet the UK's leadership in NATO could be at risk without growing concerns over our capacity to meet NATO's full obligations. While 20 NATO nations have revised their defence strategy since the start of the invasion, the government has not done so. So I ask the Foreign Secretary, will the government commit to rebooting our defence plans, and will it halt its planned cuts to the British Army? I give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and support all that's been said about the need for a long-term plan and for defeating Putin and seeing justice done. Will he agree with me that the calls of Ukrainian civil society to have more support for their lawyers and judges on the ground for those tens of thousands of cases that can be tried in Ukrainian courts should be heard, and the calls for psychosocial support for those Ukrainians who are going through trauma but need to be rebuilt and supported once Putin has been defeated?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Earlier last month, I spent time with women in Kosovo, reminding me of the horrors of war and sexual violence, and in their own pain, the work they were doing to help their Ukrainian sisters at this desperate time. It reminded me of the importance of that psychosocial support and the huge humanitarian effort that we and others must play their part in, not just over the next months, but for many, many, many years to come. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Shadow Minister. Inevitably, some people will flee the Russian advance that is coming in this spring, and some of those people might reach the United Kingdom. Does he agree with me that proper provision must be made to welcome these people and also to find permanent accommodation for them if necessary?
The Honourable Gentleman is right, and it's the reason so many British people have opened their homes to Ukrainians at this desperate time. And of course, as this new offensive begins, there will most likely be further need over the coming months. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's important to stress that this war did not begin for the Ukrainians 1 year ago. It in fact began in 2014 when Putin moved into the Donbass and when he annexed Crimea. But 1 year ago we hoped for the best, yet we faced what we seem to be unsurmountable odds. We feared the worst, but Ukraine stands defiant. The price Ukrainians have paid for their continued freedom is immense. Tens of thousands of lost, cities destroyed, families shattered, while Ukraine stands tall. Putin stands condemned and isolated. While Ukraine has won the admiration and respect of the world, Putin's ego has made Russia a pariah. While Putin expected the West to fracture and divide, his actions have drawn us together. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, we cannot become complacent. In the coming weeks and months, Ukraine will yet again face new challenges and hardships designed by Putin to test her resolve and the resolve of us all. It is our duty to the people of Ukraine to do all we can to ensure the country overcomes these challenges in the same way it has all the others. Ukraine must and will prevail.
Boris Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I want to pay tribute both to the Foreign Secretary and to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, I think, for the quality of their speeches that we've heard this afternoon. In the years since Vladimir Putin launched his vicious, unnecessary war in Ukraine, he has failed in almost all his objectives. He's failed to take Kiev, he's been sent scuttling from the Kharkiv region, he's been forced to evacuate Kherson, he has cost the lives of at least 60,000 Russian troops and with probably over 100,000 injured. In the areas he has occupied in Ukraine, he's created a new Flanders, fields of mud and trenches and blasted trees where months of high-intensity shelling and bloodshed produce gains that can be measured in yards. He's been forced
to such desperate expedients as sending prisoners to the front or terrified members of ethnic minorities recruited from remote provinces. And as my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, pointed out in his powerful speech, he is running pitifully low on the technically advanced weaponry that he increasingly needs. The seemingly irresistible force of the Russian military is breaking, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on the immovable object of Ukrainian resistance. And we in this House remain lost in our admiration for the Ukrainians, for their heroism, and for the continued inspiration that they are given by President Volodymyr Zelensky. And yet it remains all too possible that Putin can still achieve something that he can call a victory. All that he needs to do is to hang on to some piece of land that he has conquered, and the signal will go around the world that aggression can pay and that borders can be changed by force. All he needs to do to claim some kind of victory is to continue the cynical policy he's followed since the first invasion of 2014, which the Shadow Foreign Secretary rightly dwelt on, to use his foothold in Ukraine to destabilise the whole country. Unless he's purged from Ukrainian territory, he will twist his knife in the wound. He will bide his time. He will wait until he can attack again. He will continue to menace the lives of the Georgians, of the Moldovans, as the honourable member rightly pointed out, the Balts, and everyone living on the periphery of the old Soviet empire. Unless he is finally defeated in Ukraine, Putin's revanchist ambitions will be unchecked. And that is why it is so crucial that we now accelerate our support for Ukraine and give them the tools to finish the job. We can all be proud of what the governments, successive governments, have done to help the Ukrainians. And their armed forces continue to fight like lions, and it is they who deserve the credit. But be in no doubt, Western equipment has been invaluable. And the story of the last 12 months is that sooner or later, having exhausted all the other options, we give them what they need, from anti-tank missiles to HIMARS to tanks. And so that if that is the choice, sooner or later, then for heaven's sake, let's give these weapons sooner. It's absurd for Western supporters to keep asking the Ukrainians, as they were pressed at the Munich Security Conference, how long is this going to take? The answer to that question is to a large extent determined by us. It is a fine thing that we finally promised tanks, but there is no conceivable ground for delay in getting them to Ukraine. We need those machines, Abrahams, Challengers, Leopards, to make a real difference in real time in the next few weeks, not next year. It's admirable that we're proposing to train Ukrainian fighters to fly NATO fast jets. I hear the caution of my honourable friend. But it's curious that we're doing this before we've even taken the decision in principle to give them the planes. Let's cut to the chase and give them the planes too. And if the House was in any doubt about the urgency of increasing our supply of equipment to the Ukrainians, it is becoming ever clearer that China is preparing to arm the Russians. The Ukrainians have shown what they can do. They have the élan and the courage to sweep Putin from their lands, and they have the inestimable psychological advantage that they are fighting for hearth and home. With the right kit, including more long-range artillery, they can punch through the land bridge, cut off Crimea, and deal a knockout blow to Putin's plans. And they should not stop there. It is time for us all to end our obfuscation about what we think of as a Ukrainian victory and what we think of as Ukraine. The Ukrainians need to be helped to restore not just the borders of February the 24th last year, but the 1991 borders on which they voted for independence. It was the West's collective weakness in 2014, the effective acquiescence in Putin's aggression, which helped to convince him that he could launch an attack last year. And whatever the good intentions of the Normandy format, we cannot say that that process, that format, was a success, nor, frankly, can we say that the UK was right to absent ourselves from that format and from those discussions, and we must not make that mistake again. After a year of slaughter, we need to be doing more collectively to show the people of Russia what they are losing by Putin's misrule. We should be tightening the sanctions on oil and gas wherever we can. And what I hear the arguments that members are making about the need to use frozen assets, whatever the complexities, I think the House deserves to hear those arguments properly thrashed out. We should be making it clear to Putin's entire war machine, as well as the regime in the Kremlin, that they will be held to account for their crimes, the torture, rape and indiscriminate killing that they have sponsored. We must show them the mills of justice grind slowly, but they grind small. We should designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, placing that country where it now rightly belongs in the list that includes Cuba, North Korea and Syria. And by the way, we should designate the infamous and bloodthirsty Wagner Group as a foreign terrorist organisation. It is a badge that is now richly deserved and long overdue. But above all, I'm just winding up, Mr. Speaker, but above all, we must give the Ukrainians what they need to win this war this year. By ensuring that Ukraine wins and that Putin fails, we are making the best and the most financially efficient investment in the long-term security, not just of the Euro-Atlantic area, but of the whole world. We all know that we in this country made a promise to Ukraine under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum when the Ukrainians gave up their vast nuclear arsenal. We said we would come to their aid in the event of an attack. Now is the time, finally, to do what we can to honour that promise. The Ukrainians are not just fighting for their freedom, but for the cause of freedom around the world. We should give them what they need, not next month, not next year, but now.
Dave Duggan. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I want to start by echoing much of what's been said. It's very rare for us to be in this place in accord with one another, and Ukraine would that it wasn't the case, that we didn't have to talk about it at all, but it is, and we are in full accord. I want to touch on some international comparators, if I can. Estonia propose an EU-wide ammunition purchase programme for supplying Ukraine. And I wonder, I mean, it doesn't have to be the EU, Mr Deputy Speaker, but being pan-European is probably a more helpful term in this legislature, or pan-NATO, something that will increase the coordination and depth of the ongoing ammunition delivery programme. I don't want to say that in any way to undermine that which has been achieved going forward, but it's quite clear that Russia is looking to prosecute a war of attrition going on for a very long time, and it would be helpful to demonstrate to the Kremlin that the West will meet that with renewed resurgence in its supplies to Ukraine. Of course, doing that depletes the United Kingdom's defence supplies, and the supply chain has been caught short. Not their fault, Mr Deputy Speaker, but that of a slightly less than strategic defence procurement plan, dating back many defence procurement ministers, I hasten to add. But we must ensure that we step that up and get renewed pace into that. Norway, interestingly, have now passed a 5-year £6.15 billion Ukraine support package, the terms of which that will be expended is to be done in concert, obviously, with those in Ukraine. And I wonder whether the UK should seek to emulate that with ring-fenced dedicated funds over the next 5 years to send again a strong message. I'm not saying this to the Foreign Secretary to somehow say that the UK hasn't chipped in. Of course it has. Many billions of pounds and no small measure of moral support as well. But I think these measures would help to show Putin that we're not going away and we're not shrinking from the challenge, however he wishes to present it going forward. Canada, as has been touched on by other members, has changed the law to allow the seizure of Russian funds and has started the process of seizing a first batch of frozen funds to send to Ukraine. The UK should follow suit in no short order. And I do wonder what progress the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office has made with our friends in India to demonstrate to them that it is not acceptable to ride two horses in this way, that Russia's criminality cannot just be dealt with by turning a blind eye or holding your nose on the altar of cheap oil prices. You're either in the rules-based international system or you're not. And I wonder if that information has been conveyed in their most robust terms by the United Kingdom to India. China is a concern, Mr Deputy Speaker. We need in the West to develop a narrative that goes beyond cultural differences, that is not open to interpretation, and that lays it out extremely clearly to Beijing that if they ever were to make the miscalculation to supply Russia with arms and munitions and other supplies that would help them prolong this egregious invasion of Ukraine, then they would be met with very significant consequences from the West. And I'd be very interested to know what the United Kingdom government is doing in that respect. Russia, of course, itself, I'll get on to air power in a minute, Mr Deputy Speaker, but the threat of escalation is a material one, and it's one that we should pay close concentration towards. But we have, over the last 12 months, perhaps understandably, mithered over the definition of whether something is lethal or defensive, whether it's tactical or strategic, and now we've moved that on to air power. Ukraine has received an extraordinarily large amount of financial support and military assistance, but there is a pattern perhaps relieving into view, whereby Ukraine gets the weapons it was asking for previously as it's asking for the next set of weapons. And I wonder whether we should redouble our focus on what, whether or which we can do to support Ukraine with air power. In terms of logistics, as I've mentioned, the West is running out, certainly the United Kingdom is running out of surplus or even stores in ready use. And further equipment purchases will need to be done. But I don't have confidence, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the supply chain of the defence procurement apparatus as it exists currently in the United Kingdom is up to that job. And I would welcome any reassurance that the Secretary of State can give me in that regard. We should, in the United Kingdom, commit to a multi-year spending package, ring-fenced money to support Ukraine. Again, that would provide the most clearest message possible. I am pleased up to a certain extent that the United Kingdom is training combat air pilots for Ukraine. But I am left wondering to what end. And I am also wondering what is happening to the combat air pilots in training with the Royal Air Force. Some of whom, I'm not making this up, Mr Deputy Speaker, some of whom are having to wait 8 or even 9 years to become qualified. So what is the knock-on effect of training Ukraine's combat air pilots? That's not to say that it's not the right thing to do, but every action has an equal but opposite reaction, and we should see the whole picture before we celebrate, perhaps prematurely. I will indeed.
The fast jet training programme that he's referring to, which is known as MFTS, is broken, and everyone involved in aviation knows it. But we also have some Tranche 1 Typhoons that have a lot of airtime left in their airframes sitting in a warehouse that have now been taken out of RAF service. Does he agree with me that a squadron of those given to the Ukrainians would do a lot more to defend freedom, as my right honourable friend was suggesting a few moments ago, than sitting in a warehouse gathering dust?
Well, the right honourable gentleman makes a valuable point, and he does ask a direct question whether I agree with him, and I'm afraid I don't, because it's my understanding that Tranche 1 Typhoons they may have hours left, but they are, by the time you apply the penalty factors for what they did when they were flying, you won't find very many hours left. And they're also, although they look like a Typhoon, they're very old in terms of their combat air systems, and I think maybe they're not exactly what Ukraine is looking for. But it's nevertheless a valid point, which leads me directly on to my next point, which is there is not a single Typhoon in the United Kingdom available for use by Ukraine, which makes me wonder what we are training them on, unless we are training them on NATO combat air standard protocol. That's all we can do, because they won't be getting Typhoons, you mark my words. And actually, they don't want Typhoons, because people talk about we need to get pilots for Ukraine. Pilots is just the tip of the arrowhead. You need all the maintenance crews, the avionics specialists, the refuelers, the armourers. The logistic tail for a fourth-generation combat aircraft is enormously long, and none are quite as long as the Typhoons. So what they actually need is something more akin to Gripen or F-16s. And the United Kingdom doesn't have any of these. But that means that the United Kingdom is just part of the puzzle to work with allies in NATO in Europe. And Gripen in particular is ideally suited to the types of facilities that Ukraine will be able to operate from. So, in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State said that Ukraine must take land back, I think was what he said. And I wonder how he intends for Ukraine to do that without exercising air superiority. And there will be, as I think most members in this House agree, there will be a spring offensive, Mr Deputy Speaker. We need to make sure that that offensive belongs to Ukraine.
Just to remind all members that if you are taking part in the debate, not an intervention but a speech, then you will be expected to be here for the wind-ups. Thank you very much. Liz Truss.
Mr Deputy Speaker, 1 year ago on Friday, I got a phone call at 3:30 in the morning from my private secretary at the Foreign Office telling me that Vladimir Putin had begun a whole-scale invasion into Ukraine. Both airstrikes and a land invasion targeting cities across the country, including Kyiv. This was devastating news. But as well as being devastating, it was not unexpected. We'd been seeing for months the way that troops were being amassed on the border of Ukraine. And we had very good intelligence showing us exactly what Putin's plans had been. We tried for months to forestall that invasion. At the Liverpool G7 summit back in 2021, we worked with our allies to come up with a package of severe sanctions, and we warned Russia that these would be put in place in the event of an invasion. For the first time in our history, we unveiled intelligence about what the Russians were planning. They were planning to install a puppet regime in Kyiv. They were planning to install false flag operations with a view to trying to convince the world that it wasn't their fault that they invaded Ukraine, that they had been provoked. And our intelligence prevented the world believing that. And from the year of 2015, we had started training Ukrainian troops, but also we were the first European country to supply weapons to Ukraine. We'd also called out Russia internationally. I personally visited Moscow, as did many of my counterparts, to give the message directly to Sergei Lavrov and others in the Russian administration of the severe consequences of their actions. But nevertheless, Putin went ahead. Despite the warnings, despite what he knew would happen, he went ahead. Because fundamentally, he didn't believe the Ukrainians would fight, and he didn't believe that the free world would have the resolve to stand up to him. Now, he was proved wrong in both cases, and from day one, we saw sheer bravery on the part of Ukrainians defending their country. And we saw an administration in Kyiv who many people had expected to leave their posts. They'd expected Zelensky and his cabinet to flee the country. They didn't. They stayed there. And I remember being on a video conference that evening with the Defence Secretary and with our counterparts who weren't in Poland, they weren't in the United States, they were in Kyiv. And they were defending their country and asking us for our help with what we could do. And we did do all that we could. We, together with our allies, not just in the G7, but around the world, everywhere from Australia to Singapore to Switzerland, we put on the toughest sanctions, and we pushed back the Russian economy by decades. We also supplied weapons to Ukraine, and many around this chamber have commented that maybe we should have supplied weapons earlier, but I can tell you from working inside the government that we did all we could as quickly as we could to persuade allies, and we have built up now an alliance of countries supplying those weapons, and I can't wait to see the tanks, and I can't wait to see the fighter jets in Ukraine to help those brave Ukrainians. We also coordinated with our allies an international response. And at the United Nations, 141 countries stood up against Russian invasion and what Russia had done. And that too was unprecedented. But let's all be honest. We should have done more earlier. The reason that Putin took the action he took is because he didn't believe we would follow through. And we didn't take him at his word. As far back in 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, Putin made it very clear what his intentions were. He has talked on many occasions about creating a greater Russia. He took action, as we know, on Crimea, on the Donbass, but we didn't do enough. We let it pass. We collectively turned far too much of a blind eye. We also, I'm afraid to say, and this is not just the United Kingdom, this is Europe, this is the free world, we imported Russian gas and oil. We saw money flow in from Russia. Money that was later to be used to buy the weapons that would be used against the Ukrainian people. And we also failed to take action on defending Ukraine. Now, my colleague, the member for Uxbridge, commented on, the Right Honourable, of course, Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge, sorry about that, I do apologise. I should, let's be honest, I should have more respect after everything. But as my Right Honourable friend commented earlier, we signed the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which guaranteed the security of Ukraine. So we should have provided more weapons to Ukraine, and I believe we should have allowed Ukraine to join NATO. Can we imagine this situation if Ukraine had been a NATO member under Article 5 protection? This would simply not happen. I will give way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 1994 Budapest Accords also was signed by Russia.
It was.
That guaranteed the sovereignty of Ukraine.
Absolutely right.
So Russia is to blame as well.
Absolutely right.
Well,
and America.
I completely agree with my honourable friend that Russia is, of course, to blame. But we should hold ourselves to high standards. And we should follow through on commitments that we have made. And so should our other allies like the United States. And I feel that this is unfinished business in terms of offering Ukraine the security that they needed. And that is why I believe we need to learn the lessons from what has happened. Because, frankly, we were complacent about freedom and democracy after the Cold War. We were told it was the end of history and that freedom and democracy were guaranteed and we could carry on living our lives, not really worrying about what else had happened, that there wouldn't be a challenge to those basic principles, that we'd won the argument. I think we know now that that argument is never finally won. Absolutely. And we need to keep winning the argument. We need to keep defending our values with hard security and economic security if we are to succeed. So first of all, we need to do all we can to make sure Ukraine wins this war as soon as possible. Every extra day, are lives lost, women violated, towns destroyed. We need to do all we can as fast as we can. My view is that does include fighter jets. And we've had a discussion today about which are the best possible options. Having spoken to the Ukrainians about this months and months ago, I know what they want is an option. They want, so let's work with our allies to get them an option to be able to use, because otherwise they won't be able to prevail. And we also need to make sure that they have the economic wherewithal to continue the fight, and we need to make sure we're continuing to support them internationally as well. But the second thing we need to do is not be complacent when that war is won, because I do believe Ukraine will win this war. I think there is no way that Russia will win the war. But we need to make sure that the future of Russia is a more positive future than the one we enabled at the end of the Cold War.
Right.
And what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means never again becoming complacent in the face of Russian money, Russian oil and gas, instead making sure that any lifting of sanctions is tied to reform in Russia. We can never have the situation again where we enable freedom and free trade between the West and Russia, and that is then used to develop a kleptocracy, which is exactly what we have seen take place. And we also need to make sure that Russia pays for the crimes it has committed. The appalling atrocities and war crimes need to be held to account, all of them. And we need to make sure that money seized from the Russian state is used to rebuild Ukraine. That, to me, is vitally important. Of course, we in well-off countries like Britain should contribute. But I cannot imagine a situation where Russia can simply go ahead as if nothing had happened and don't contribute to rebuilding Ukraine. I think that is absolutely vital, and I will be pushing for that to happen. But the third thing we need to learn is about how we deal with authoritarian regimes more broadly. And President Xi has made it very, very clear about his intentions with respect to Taiwan. We have to take these seriously. Now, during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, we have amassed, for the first time in history, a group of nations who are prepared to put on sanctions, who are prepared to act together. We need to formalise this grouping. I've described it as an economic NATO. The G7 plus our key allies, like the EU, like South Korea, like Australia, we need to bring that group together and start developing our plans now. Because what we know is that we ended up doing these things after the invasion of Ukraine. And my view is prevention is far better than cure. So let's develop these economic tools. And let's be clear with China exactly what would happen if there was an escalation with respect to Taiwan. Let's be clear about that now. And let's also make sure that Taiwan is able to defend itself. Let's not leave another free democracy undefended for an authoritarian regime to invade. That, for me, is a very important principle. Because the reality is, there are fewer people as a proportion of the world's population living under democracy now than there were 30 years ago. Can we imagine what the world will look like in 30 years' time if we don't act now? It's not a world I want to live in. I think we've heard some excellent contributions to the debate, and I'm very pleased about the unity we're seeing and continuing to see across the United Kingdom. We need to do all we can to support Ukraine, and we need to act as quickly as possible. And I'm familiar with the vagaries of the government machine after spending 10 years in various different government departments, so I do all I can to support my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, in his efforts to make sure that things happen as quickly as possible. But we also need to not forget the broader arguments. Freedom and democracy are the lifeblood of our society and other free societies around the world, and we need to be prepared to do all we can to defend them now, before it's too late. The fact is that being tough is what will bring us peace, and that is what we need to do.
Hear, hear.
I'd also like to welcome our friends from the United States of America, from Washington. You are most welcome to our proceedings today. Liam Byrne.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and it's a great privilege actually to follow what was an excellent speech from the Right Honourable Lady and indeed the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge, as well as the two front benches. There are just sort of three things that I wanted to add to this debate this afternoon. Well, first, about the importance of how we break the balance of force that we see arranged on the ground. Second, how we now choke the oligarchs of war who are helping supply Putin's war machine. And third, there is some more that we need to say about how we commence the pursuit for justice, because I was a little unhappy actually to hear the Foreign Secretary, who is just exiting his place, not row in behind the Vice President of the United States and say that our government too had arrived at the conclusion that Russia was committing crimes against humanity. One does have to ask, how much more evidence do they really need? But let me just start with first things first, which is the call that we heard loud and clear from two former Prime Ministers today, which is about the need to supply what Ukraine needs now. The truth is that both sides of this conflict are going to find it difficult to summon together the 400,000 to 500,000 troops that are going to be necessary to make a breakthrough one way or the other. And so the challenge that may well lie ahead is that Ukraine suffers this pattern that we have today, which is more and more troops being thrown into infantry attacks under artillery fire in the east of the country, with endless missile strikes on population centres. That is a grinding, terrible waste of life. And so I think we've got to leapfrog out of this bad habit that we've gotten into, that first we say no and then we say yes. And there is this extended time period between the saying no and then the saying yes. So on air defence, we said no to Patriot missiles until it was that we said yes. On tanks, we said no until months and months later we said yes. Now, can we please just short-circuit the process of sending in the F-16s as fast as possible with trained pilots? It's great to hear that we are training pilots, but what we saw last week at the Munich Security Council conference was a clear consensus between Democrats and Republicans alike, sending a very clear message to the President of the United States that they thought that it was time that fast jets were sent to support our allies in Ukraine. We heard directly from President Zelensky, just a few yards from here, the wings of freedom are needed today. So let's jump out of the no and get to yes as fast as possible. Of course.
Very quickly, we gave 14 Challenger tanks, Challenger 2s, to Ukraine. They are very capable tanks, but in and of themselves, they will not change the whole course of the war. But what they did do was help to unlock the delivery of hundreds of Leopards. What the Ukrainians really want are MiGs that they're familiar with using in F-16s. But by the same argument, if we gave one squadron of older Typhoons that then unlocked hundreds of MiGs and F-16s, it would be worth doing, wouldn't it?
Personally, I think yes. But my key point, I suppose, to the front bench on the Treasury benches is please can we short-circuit the time that it takes to get from no to yes. We've gone through this loop, this doom loop, at least twice before. Let's short-circuit the nonsense now and crack on with it. And so I think the message from to the Treasury benches is they will find cross-party consensus on this question. Please just put the decision on the dispatch box in front of them. We've heard last week from the head of the Ukrainian Air Force that these fast jets are needed now in order to change the balance of power on the battlefield, but also to protect the population centres from Iranian drones as well as Russian cruise missiles. And so every single day that we do not take this decision is a day when Putin is allowed to continue raining terror down, not just on the troops of the brave Ukrainian armed forces, but on the civilians of Ukraine. He is using this capability now to perpetrate war crimes, and we have a moral responsibility in this country to damn well stop him. Second, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have got to move harder and faster to choke to death the oligarchs of war, starting with the dogs of war at the head of the Wagner Group. Frankly, we were too slow to implement the sanctions that we have. I'm glad that this House passed with cross-party consent the measures that we took to basically allow us to cut and paste the EU sanctions regime with a little bit of the American regime to get that into place. It was a shame that it took the war in Ukraine to actually move a little bit further ahead on some of the anti-kleptocracy laws that we have now, but here we are. All progress is good. However, Mr Deputy Speaker, there is clear evidence that sanctions are being widely evaded by goods and oil being exported to India and to China, being rebadged and then re-exported from there. And so, given that we have an Office for Financial Sanctions Implementation in the Treasury that thinks it's okay to issue sanction waivers to Prigozhin and his lawyers, can I urge the Treasury benches to get a lot tougher, together with the Americans if necessary, in actually clamping down on this export and re-export business, because it is supplying dollars right now that are buying weapons to support Putin. The symbol, however, of a different order of things has got to be a radically different approach to taking on the Wagner Group. We know that today the Wagner Group is recruiting from prisons, they're recruiting from all over, they are mobilising forces on the Eastern Front in Ukraine. Frankly, they have opened a second front against democracy in Russia as well. They are active in at least 5 countries, and they have business interests in at least another 15 countries. They are short-circuiting the sanctions regime by trading in oil, trading in manganese, in gold, in uranium, you name it. So it is a matter of concern to this House that we are woefully behind the sanctions regime that the United States and the Europeans have put in place to suffocate Prigozhin and his forces.
On that point.
I will, of course.
I thank my right honourable friend, and he's making an excellent speech. In terms of the Wagner Group, would he agree with me that we also need to try to rein in the growing influence of the Wagner Group within Africa? There are many nations across the globe wherein the Wagner Group is making more and more of an impact in eroding democracy. So it's about time that our government, working with allies, try to clamp that down.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and the right honourable lady talked about the need for a global alliance to defend democracy. Well, that global alliance has got to extend to Africa. Yeah. And the fact that there are now 5 countries where the Wagner Group is active, the fact that they are poised to make something of a breakthrough in the Sahel after the French evacuation from Mali, is a matter that should concern us. Frankly, we should be getting a lot tougher on them, and that should start with a much more comprehensive sanctions regime. So, can I urge the Minister who is winding up to tell us that they will be replicating the United States sanction regime on 21 different individuals who are associated with the Wagner Group and 16 different corporate entities. That is 3 times more sanctions than we have against individuals or businesses associated with Prigozhin. Let's go further. We have had now on the 23rd of January a very clear pronouncement from our allies in the United States that they have declared the Wagner Group to be a prescribed organisation because it is patently a transnational criminal organisation. Yet when the minister, who is not in his place, came before the Foreign Affairs Committee just a couple of weeks ago, and, Mr Deputy Speaker, we were grateful he was there, because the truth is that for some time the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence couldn't quite decide who was the minister responsible for taking on the Wagner Group. And anyway, in due course, the machine did its job, and the poor minister was summoned before us. He was not able to answer when the Wagner Group was going to be sanctioned. Indeed, he extracted himself from the line of questioning by saying that, of course, it wasn't his job, it was a matter for the Home Office. So, joined-up government at its very best, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, what we've got at the moment is not good enough. We need a clear plan, a clear timetable, a clear commitment from the Minister today that the Wagner Group will be sanctioned here just as it is in the United States of America. We need a clear commitment that the number of individuals who have been sanctioned by the Americans will be the same individuals who have been sanctioned here. We need a clear commitment that the individuals the European Union has sanctioned will be individuals that are sanctioned here as well. And then finally, while we're at it, could we now end the scandal that the Treasury itself is licensing sanction waivers for Russian warlords to fly lawyers from London to St Petersburg to summon up a case, to prosecute, to sue journalists like Elliot Higgins in English courts? What a complete scandal. And then just to tap it all, last week Elliot Higgins is told that he's the security risk and so he can't be allowed to go to cinema showings of the new film about the brave Mr Navalny. What have we become, Mr Deputy Speaker, where we are licensing English lawyers to sue English journalists in English court? It's not good enough. It's an outrage and it needs to stop, and we need to send a clear signal from this House this afternoon that it ends now. While he's at it, he might actually consider paying Mr Elliot Higgins' legal bills. I'm told that Prigozhin, surprise, surprise, this will surprise the House, Mr Prigozhin has not paid his legal bills, about £116,000, but poor Mr Elliot Higgins has. He's had to cough up about £70,000. So maybe the government benches could do a little whip round for Mr Higgins and supply an apology to him and Bellingcat at the end of this debate. So, we have got to make sure that the weapons supplies are in place. We have got to make sure that the sanctions regime is far more effective than it is today. And the third piece of the puzzle has got to be we have got to commence the search for justice. It is excellent that the United Kingdom has come together with its allies to ensure that there are prosecutions for war crimes, but I think many of us in this House will want to see prosecutions for the crime of aggression as well. The abuse that has been laid out has been appalling. Murder, torture, rape, deportation, executions, electrocutions, the crimes of Bucha, the sexual assault of a 4-year-old child was reported to the United Nations last week. That is why all of us in this House today should welcome the statement by the Vice President of the United States last week that the US has formally determined that Russia has committed crimes against humanity. We should make the same declaration ourselves. We should do it quickly, and I hope we will hear a game plan for just that from the Minister at the end of the debate. I give way.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Speaking as someone that has given evidence in war crimes trials, 5 of them, the thing that really horrified me was we only got a very small percentage of the people that carried out these crimes. Yeah. And I'm talking about genocide and war against humanity. A very small percentage, so small it's almost impossible to measure. And so if we're going to do this properly, we've got to put a heck of a lot of effort into having war crimes trials, almost more than after the Nuremberg trials, etc.
The whole of this House is grateful to the work of the gallant and honourable member, because we know that more people were prosecuted because of the work that he did than would have otherwise been the case. And he is absolutely right to say what he has said. It was 80 years ago that the free world came together to ensure the prosecution of the guilty at Nuremberg. And the charge, the table of crimes that was presented, was very clear. It was crimes against humanity, and we should remind ourselves in this House exactly what that table of crimes entails. Murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, persecution on political, racial and religious grounds. Those are precisely the crimes that President Putin has committed in Ukraine. And we must make sure that, just as we did in Nuremberg, the free world comes together once more to hold him, as well as his henchmen, to account.
Thank you very much. Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And it is a matter of great satisfaction that we have American visitors present today to witness the absolute unity of outlook on both sides of this chamber. It can never be stressed too often that there are three concepts that lie at the heart of defence and security. They are deterrence, containment, and the unpredictability of future conflicts. To give an example of the last, one has only to look at the exchange between my right honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge and former Prime Minister, and myself on the day of the invasion, when I asked him, and I quote, "If as appears likely Ukraine gets overwhelmed, will we offer to give sanctuary to a government in exile pending Ukraine's future freedom?" And he replied quite sensibly, "One of the points he made to President Zelensky this morning was that it might be necessary for him to find a safe place for him and his cabinet to go." And I was quite sensible in asking that question, and my right honourable friend was quite sensible in giving that answer. Because let's be frank, not many people thought, at least not many people outside the cabinet and government of Ukraine, thought that Ukraine had much chance of resisting what appeared to be, and indeed was, a massive, albeit ill-conceived onslaught against numerically far smaller forces. Now, I said there are three concepts. That is an example of the unpredictability of future warfare, and therefore I would just like to remind amateur strategists, such as myself, in all parties, that just as we were not prepared for the successful resistance of Ukraine, we shouldn't now become too complacent that Ukraine cannot possibly be defeated. We could wake up tomorrow to find there had been some terrific, unexpected Russian breakthrough and that the whole strategic situation had changed completely. And that is why the appeals that are being made so strongly from both sides of the House that we must, to coining someone else coining a phrase, give them the tools to finish the job. And in terms of deterrence, well, it can be argued deterrence failed, but then why did deterrence fail in terms of Russia invading Ukraine? I'm sorry to share this with friends from across the Atlantic, but I feel that one reason deterrence failed in that context was the fact that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia came almost 6 months to the day from the catastrophic and bungled exit from Afghanistan by NATO. I'm not saying that that planted the seed in Putin's mind to do what he did, but it certainly may well have affected the timing of him doing something that he had almost certainly wanted to do for a very long time. And so we have to bear in mind what sort of signals we were sending. And the answer is we were sending signals of weakness. And when you send signals of weakness to an authoritarian, which is the rather mild term used these days for what most of us from another era would call the totalitarian type of government, you ought to know what to expect their behaviour to be. So I've talked about the unpredictability, I've talked about the limitations of deterrence. albeit that there's one element of deterrence because it is more certain what the results will be if you dare to put it to the test, namely nuclear deterrence. That is nevertheless something that everyone has to consider in every scenario, no matter what sort of terrible fighting and atrocious behaviour may go on below the level of the nuclear threshold. So let's talk a little bit, however, about containment. And containment is what you have to do when you are faced with a deeply hostile opponent. It is no good talking about battling for mutual understanding. The trouble is you can have mutual understanding where one person understands that the other person is a Democrat and the Democrat understands that the other person is a totalitarian dictator. That is not a recipe for peace. It is actually a sound portrayal of a situation where, unless the Democrat shows the dictator that he cannot get his own way by force of arms, the dictator will try to get his own way by force of arms. I've got two other topics I want to touch on very briefly in this contribution. One is to draw attention to an important analysis that appeared on a website called Desk Russie on the 30th of December 2021, which was just 2 months before the invasion. And it was by an old friend of mine. I've known her for the best part of 40 years, a brilliant French historian and former Sovietologist called Dr. Françoise Thom. And she drew attention to 2 draft text treaties which had been unveiled by the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 17th of December 2021, one being a treaty between the United States and the Russian Federation on security guarantees, and the other being an agreement on measures to ensure the security of the Russian Federation and the member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And what was made absolutely clear was that these were take-it-or-leave-it offers, and they were encapsulated by the Deputy Foreign Minister Grushko, who said, and I quote, "The Europeans must also think about whether they want to avoid making their continent the scene of a military confrontation. They have a choice. Either they take seriously what is put on the table, or they face a military technical alternative. That's war to the rest of us." This is a deputy foreign minister stating in terms that unless European states do what Russia wants, then they can expect to be embroiled in armed conflict. A former Deputy Minister of Defense, Andrei Katapolov, Duma Defense Committee, said as follows: "Our partners," meaning our partners in the West, "must understand that the longer they drag out the examination of our proposals and the adoption of real measures to create these guarantees, the greater the likelihood that they will suffer a preemptive strike." Now, what was in these draft treaties? I'll just give you one example. Article 4 states, in part, that, and I quote, "The Russian Federation and all participants, which were, as of 27th May 1997, member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, shall not deploy their armed forces and armaments on the territory of any other European state, in addition to the forces stationed on that territory as of 27th of May 1997. What's the significance of 1997? Well, it's this, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was only after 1997 that 14 of the present 30 members of NATO joined the alliance. So starting in 1999, you had the Czech Republic, you had Hungary, and you had Poland, and then you had almost a dozen more. And so what the Russians were basically saying is, unless America agrees to withdraw its support from all these newly freed democracies, and unless all NATO countries agree to withdraw their armed forces from all those NATO member countries, they can expect to find themselves in an armed conflict with Russia. And the trouble is that statements of this sort do not get reported in the West as clearly as they should be, if at all. They are generally kept in, as it were, the specialised centres and the highly learned brains of people like Dr. Françoise Thom. And I'm basically saying that there are three outcomes when you get into a situation like this. The first is you can capitulate. The second is open warfare. And the third is containment, otherwise known in the old days as Cold War. And I really resent it when people say, oh, you don't want to go back to the Cold War. Well, if the alternatives are capitulation or open warfare, then the Cold War is the very best you can do in staring down an aggressor. And I end, Madam Deputy Speaker, where I began with an intervention, which is just to draw attention to the state of the UK's defence budget, notwithstanding the considerable injection of cash which was made under the previous Prime Minister, my right honourable friend, for Uxbridge. Even that only brought our percentage of defence expenditure up from about 2.1% of GDP to 2.3%. And in a few years earlier, in around 2015, there was a change in the accounting methods for calculating what our expenditure on defence was for purposes of GDP, and that was not an illegitimate change. It just led to us including certain items which NATO count towards defence expenditure, which we had not previously done. If it hadn't been for that change in accounting, our expenditure on defence would not have been at 2.1%, which is what it was before my right honourable friend's cash injection. It would have been at 1.8%. And his cash injection would have taken it up to 2.1%. Now, under the old system of accounting, in the mid-1990s, we were still spending 3% of GDP on defence. At the height of the Cold War in the mid-1980s, as I've said time and again to this House, we regularly and consistently spent, under the old system of accounting, between 4.5% and 5% of GDP on defence. We hear talk of arguments between the Defence Ministry and the Treasury on whether or not some extra billions will be made available. We all recognise that if Ukraine succeeds in defeating this aggression, they're doing it for their own benefit, but they will benefit the whole of the Western world, because it means that the odds of us ever having to engage in that sort of fighting ourselves against a regime of this sort in Russia will be massively reduced. Ask yourself, Madam Deputy Speaker, what we would do if we found ourselves against our will forced into a conflict of that sort. Immediately, the amount that we had to spend on defence would shoot up not to 3%, but probably to something like 10 or 15% of just about every single scrap of effort, financially, economically and industrially, that this country could possibly do, because that is what always happens if you find yourself in a war, not to mention all the costs in human life and treasure and misery. And therefore, this should be seen as an investment. We are investing, if we increase our defence budget, in the freedom of Ukraine, and we are investing in the freedom and the peace of the whole of the Western world.
Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow on from the honourable member opposite from New Forest East and to hear such unity across this House on this issue. A year on, this war will leave lasting imprints on every Ukrainian and indeed on world history. This time and this milestone will mean something different to every person affected by it. And here today, we know that this moment shows that history will stand on the side of the Ukrainian people. International security and the stability of the world order were threatened when Russian Federation forces began their invasion on the 24th of February 2022. Whilst the future appeared uncertain, through the indescribable bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian people, its military forces and indeed its government, Ukraine has exercised its power and turned what could have been a brief moment in time into an historical struggle for freedom. And I've spoken before in this place about the human impact of this war. And in December, I visited Lviv, Kyiv and the region of Kharkiv with the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green. We joined the charity Siobhan's Trust, whose humanitarian aid reflects our core British values. Their work in feeding over 4,000 displaced Ukrainians every day is to be both admired and applauded. And everywhere we went, the real power of the Ukrainian people was clear to see. Putin's forces had inflicted horrific damage on their towns, cities and villages. I saw blocks of flats, people's homes gutted by missile attacks in Kharkiv, schools destroyed in Statini, and homes peppered with shrapnel in Ruska Lozova. And one soldier told me about the horror of removing the dead bodies from bombed-out buildings, mostly homes. He showed me a photograph of a dead little boy laid out on a bench, and he told me that the father had clung on to him with desperation and he had to be pulled from his son. And in typical Ukrainian understatement, he said, "It's hard." And he told me of his men who found it too hard and who'd gone home and shot themselves. He worried for his men who urgently needed help in dealing with the impact of stress whilst still serving on the front line. But despite the inhumanity of war, the Ukrainian people live with dignity and compassion as they fight on bravely towards victory. And I met with businesses who were working to keep Ukraine's economy functioning in the most challenging of circumstances, under bombing and planned power cuts. Businesses such as the potato factory, which despite war has kept its investments in Ukraine. This is their contribution to the war effort, to keep the economy going, to provide food for the nation, jobs for workers and to pay taxes to fund Ukraine's war efforts. These people and businesses defy Putin's best efforts to crush the free spirit of Ukraine. They are essential to success in this war, and when the time comes, they will continue to support Ukraine as it flourishes again as a peaceful and independent state. And of course, we must continue to support Ukraine by providing it with the necessary military capabilities. But equally, we must support the recovery effort, and I praise the upcoming Ukraine Recovery Conference, jointly hosted by the UK Government and Ukraine. Because no matter when this war ends, we must begin laying the foundations for structural and economic recovery now. And to close, Madam Deputy Speaker, everywhere myself and my right honourable friend went in Ukraine, the same message was delivered to us. Do not forget us. Yeah. Ukraine can claim astonishing victories already. The war may well continue, but Ukraine has achieved what many once believed was impossible. For the last year, it has firmly withstood a hostile invading force intent on bringing democracy to its knees. History is being rewritten. History is being written by Ukraine. Freedom will win. Slava Ukraine.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it is an honour to follow both the Right Honourable Member for New Forest East and the Honourable Member for Bradford South, who really did bring this back down to the individual experience of a terrible war. So I'm grateful. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes arguing that we should Provide for war and prepare for peace. That is, we in the UK should increase seriously our industrial production for defence, for Ukraine and for our own, while also isolating Russia and seizing diplomatic opportunities when they arise. So you could characterise it as better preparation for war and jaw-jaw. I would like also to identify a couple of events from the last century or so that can shine a light on the situation that Ukraine finds itself facing, and that Ukraine's partners find ourselves facing. They are the 1915 shell crisis in Britain on the one hand, and the 1999 withdrawal of Yugoslav security forces from Kosovo on the other. First, let's recall NATO's role in this war. In Russian propaganda right now, Moscow is characterising this as NATO's war. The Kremlin suggests that the government in Kyiv is a puppet and that NATO is pulling the strings. But it couldn't be further from the truth. The provision of arms by Ukraine's partners, such as the UK, is often a reactive response to requests for support. I'd like to pay credit to the British government and credit to the Secretary of State for Defence and the Ministry of Defence for repeatedly stating that this is Ukraine's war, that Ukraine is our close partner and that we are supplying Ukraine with equipment and support. But the contrary to Russian propaganda, this is not NATO's war, and that there is no sense in which NATO is threatening Russia. But nor are we in the business of subcontracting policy to the government in Kyiv. We should not be answering each and every request on this reactive basis. There are times when we should be supplying equipment proactively. For example, the British government announced that it would be supplying Warrior infantry fighting vehicles when asked, though the Liberal Democrats have been calling for this in the months prior to that announcement. But we should anticipate requests by Ukraine rather than waiting for them to land. The Right Honourable Member for Birmingham Hodge Hill suggested that there's this pattern of saying no until we say yes. But then I would say, rightly, the UK is stepping up its provision at a time when we know that our allies have moved or are ready to move.
On that point,
I would be great.
We may as well just try and round out the cross-party consensus that I think is emerging. Would the Honourable Member agree that we should be doing everything we can to send fast jets to Ukraine?
I would suggest to the Right Honourable Member that if we are to send fast jets to Ukraine, it is going to be a symbolic gesture, because what we heard from the Minister when we visited Kyiv, he and I, last September, was that Minister Reznikov was asking for Gripen aircraft, as we've heard from in this chamber today. So if we're to do so, it's not because we've got the capability that is particularly useful to Ukraine, it's because it'll be a symbolic first-mover gesture that others can follow. I think that another example of this is clearly the provision of main battle tanks, once we knew that other countries were at least considering or almost ready to provide main battle tanks. But we do have to have greater anticipation of what demand arrives before it takes for Zelensky to visit us and to make those requests. We've heard that Ukrainian forces are firing up to 5,000 artillery rounds per day. Ukraine's partners will struggle to maintain supply at that level from our existing stockpiles, and we're going to need to procure artillery rounds quickly. Just-in-time acquisition might play well on spreadsheets, but it has not played well in relation to our inventories. There are times when matters of supply really are crucial. Britain found itself short of high explosive rounds in 1915. Lloyd George was appointed the inaugural Minister for Munitions, a position that, when he became Prime Minister, he gave to his fellow Liberal, Winston Churchill, who became Minister for Munitions in 1917. The creation of a Ministry for Munitions indicated just how serious Britain was in prosecuting the war. I'm not for a moment suggesting that we need today to promote the Minister for Defence Procurement, but we do need to coordinate the purchase of munitions with our allies, given that we are drawing on the same Western suppliers in many instances, and we need to do it on an enduring basis. We see now that Russia is moving increasingly towards a total war footing, where it's mobilising increasingly the resources of its society and of its economy to the war effort. It may have sought to play down the so-called special military operation last February, but it's increasingly having to recognise that what it's created is followed the full-scale invasion, and the time will eventually arrive for Ukrainian negotiation. It should come from a position of strength for Ukraine. When the time comes for negotiation, we should be open to the leverage that Beijing will have with Moscow, that NATO nations do not. To illustrate, recall how the orders were eventually given for the withdrawal of Yugoslav security forces from Kosovo. Yugoslavia conceded when it realised that it was isolated. If we think about the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in the spring and summer of 1999, NATO was bombing military sites across Serbia and Montenegro in pursuit of the withdrawal of Yugoslav security forces. This followed ethnic cleansing that Yugoslav security forces had perpetrated against Kosovo Albanians. But the NATO bombing campaign had gone on for more than 10 weeks. There was no sign that Slobodan Milosevic was prepared to concede and withdraw Yugoslav military and paramilitary personnel from Kosovo. The NATO enforcement actions seemed to be stuck, and NATO bombing sorties were striking the same targets repeatedly. President Yeltsin played an important role in persuading Slobodan Milosevic to withdraw Yugoslav security forces from Kosovo. As Boris Yeltsin's Balkans envoy, Viktor Chernomyrdin communicated to Milosevic that Belgrade could no longer depend on diplomatic support from an ally. Chernomyrdin was later to become a dreadful Russian ambassador to Ukraine, and he's rightly very unpopular in Ukraine. But he was successful in persuading Milosevic that he had no ally to whom he could turn for support. Milosevic chose to consent to the withdrawal of Yugoslav security forces only when he realised just how isolated he was. So let's not us be too dismissive of China's offer before we know what it is. Of course, we should pay careful attention to the speech that is coming up by President Xi on Friday. It will probably be full of platitudes. It might offer nothing except a ceasefire based on the current possession by Russian forces of Ukrainian land, in which case it would clearly be completely unacceptable. But the current statements made by China relate to the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And so we're not there yet, but China may have a role to play in pressuring Russia into its eventual withdrawal from Ukraine. We would have that discussion not being naive about China's motives. Russia and China have been adversaries to each other, so it might suit China to have Russia and the West depleting their weapons stockpiles in a conflict taking place far away from the Asian Indo-Pacific. But nor does it suit China to have the West threatening consequences against China, as Blinken warned would result from the supply of arms by China to Russia. Russian people need to know that this is Russia's war. It's not NATO's war, and nor is it China's war. We in the UK do need to prepare UK defence just now like this war is our own. We must supply Ukraine so that it can capture more of its territory before it seeks to enter into a ceasefire. And then at that point, we should be open to recognising the value that Russia's partners can have in persuading Putin to pull back.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow on from the member for Tiverton and Honiton, and indeed members from across the House. I speak as a socialist, an anti-imperialist, and as someone who feels disgust at the thought of war. And it's not despite these values that I support the Ukrainian resistance, it's because of them. To me, socialism means self-determination for ordinary working people, not ceding power to tyrants seeking to oppress them. Anti-imperialism means opposing all states that seek to extend their power by dominating others, regardless of what flag they fly. It's impossible to talk about the war in Ukraine without addressing the bloody history of Russian imperialism. It's a history that our friends across Eastern and Northern Europe don't need to be reminded of. They know that what's at stake is not just lines on a map and whose flag flies above a town hall. No, a nation that survived the Holodomor understands the invader's aims: the erasure of a people, the eradication of its culture, and the destruction of its democracy. It's easy to debate geopolitics from the comfort of London, but the stakes feel very different when you hear directly from someone sleeping in a bomb shelter. And when I speak to workers, to trade unionists in Ukraine, or to refugees hoping to see their home again, their message is clear and heartfelt: don't abandon us. Madam Deputy Speaker, it would not be an anti-war stance to turn our backs on Ukraine. It would be sending a message to despots around the globe that war crimes pay. It would be accepting a global order based not on international law and respect for sovereignty, but on torture, murder, and nuclear threats. The Ukrainian resistance isn't asking us for thoughts and prayers. Solidarity means helping Ukraine defend itself, and we can and we must do more. Over 1,000 military vehicles were sold off by the Ministry of Defence last year. So I ask, Madam Deputy Speaker, why aren't we donating them to Ukraine instead? But of course, Putin doesn't just fight with tanks and missiles. He fights with disinformation and manipulation, flooding the internet with propaganda. Discouraging Ukraine's allies is a key part of his plan, and we won't fall for it. As the UK struggles with a painful cost of living crisis, Putin wants us to blame support for Ukraine. But while soaring energy bills are forcing workers into food banks, energy giants are popping champagne bottles, celebrating their record profits. Instead of giving up on solidarity, we must tax those who profit from war and misery. If we talk about poverty, we must think about Ukraine too. After a year of relentless attack, the country is devastated and ordinary people are paying the price. Its economy contracted by a third last year, inflation stands at 26%, and more than a quarter of people are unemployed. It will take years for the nation to heal and rebuild. And when Russian troops are finally pushed out, our solidarity can't end. It's not enough to freeze Ukraine's debt. It must be cancelled. Let's close loopholes in our sanctions regime and liquidate seized assets to fund reconstruction. Madam Deputy Speaker, future economic support can't come with conditions of brutal austerity either. The international community must come together to support the rebuilding of Ukraine's public services, the creation of green jobs, and the strengthening of its democracy. Decisions about the reconstruction process can't be made by oligarchs and foreign companies seeking to profit from it, but by the Ukrainian people themselves, with input from trade unions and civil society. And meanwhile, we must accept all refugees seeking safety from the war, ensuring access to decent housing and the services they need. To all Ukrainians in the UK today, I say you're always welcome here and to call this country your home. But I know that's not what many of you want. So I hope and sincerely believe that soon you will be able to return to a free and peaceful Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I say what a pleasure it is to speak in this debate and make a contribution? I want to focus on, if I can, and some of the speeches have, indeed all of the speeches that have made contributions have referred to the war, but I want to maybe be more specific in what I'm going to speak to. My stance on Ukraine is well known in this chamber, has been consistent, as is everybody else's as well. I believe we do need to do more to support our allies in Ukraine. And I said this before, the visit of President Zelensky, who by his very nature inspires everyone who he meets and does give the leadership that Ukraine needs. Russia's aggression must be halted, not simply for the lives destroyed in Ukraine, but for the message that needs to be and must be sent. My heart aches as I watch the news and see lives torn apart in Ukraine. And as I look into the eyes of some of the refugees who have come from Ukraine to Northern Ireland and the hurt that they have, the eyes tell much, Madam Deputy Speaker, when it comes to conveying the issues and how people feel. And I remember when I had the occasion through the APPG for Freedom of Religious Belief to go to Poland to see some of the conditions that Poland were offering. And they never had to tell you anything about what they've been through. You just looked at them and their eyes told you everything of the pain, the suffering and the memories that they had. And in Northern Ireland, we've been very pleased to have taken many of those refugees. But they've left their loved ones and their homes left behind. And as they wonder, will they ever be able to go home, and what that home will now look like? And we'll see the bombs, the Russia and the destruction. It is clear that this House and our government must, perhaps with others, step up and do more. Russia's aggression, as I said to the Minister in an intervention in the beginning, I referred to the systematic abuse by Russian soldiers, given the authority at the highest level of government, of generals, right down the rape, the sexual abuse of women and girls, some as young as 4, some as old as 83 years old. So that gives you an idea about the systematic cruelty of the Russian soldiers and of the abuse that they carry out. I'd also like to draw attention, if I can, to the violations of freedom of religion or belief, and that's what I want to speak to in this short time that I address the House. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine enters its second year, it's important to note that the attacks on religious freedom and other human rights are escalating. Reports show that the Russian military has destroyed, has damaged or looted at least 494 religious buildings, theological institutions and sacred sites in Ukraine since the start of the invasion just last year. According to international humanitarian law, unjustifiable attacks against religious sites constitute war crimes, as they are, and we all recognise that in this place. Such attacks are happening in tandem with attacks on pastors and religious leaders in the region. These attacks are not only against the Ukrainian Orthodox believers and their churches, but also against evangelicals, evangelical prayer houses too, because there are many home churches across Ukraine, especially in the east of the province, as well as Catholic, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jewish and Muslim sites. The Institute for Religious Freedom has found that Russian forces have also abducted Ukrainian pastors and tried to enlist them as Russian spies and propagandists. Baptist churches have been destroyed in the eastern part of Ukraine. They've been damaged by bombs as well. There's been a systematic destruction of those properties. Baptist pastors have went missing over the last couple of years, indeed over the last 4 to 5 years. Some of them have never been found, and we do question just exactly what has happened to them. From February 24 to July 15, 2022, the Institute recorded 20 cases of illegal imprisonment of Ukrainian religious leaders, accompanied by attempted rape, by mock executions, by deprivation of water, of food and access to toilets, and threats of violence against family members, not only the person of the church who leads the church, but the families as well. Moreover, it's not only Ukrainians who suffer at Russia's hands. Russia's religious leaders who voice opposition to the war in Ukraine also fear for their lives. And I quote one of those cases. Moscow Patriarch priest Alexander Debesky fled Russia in January of this year, just shortly after the police from the FSB had opened a criminal case against him. He had repeatedly preached against the war in Ukraine. Everything related to my anti-war position was recorded in a most thorough manner, he told Forum 18. This is just one of many cases where religious leaders are targeted and suffer for speaking the truth and acting in accord with their conscience. I want to put on record my thanks to our government, to our ministers, to the former Prime Ministers who have both spoken in this chamber, and their strong stance on these issues. I think their leadership at that time inspired not just the United Kingdom but the rest of NATO and across the world to stand strong with Ukraine, and I thank them for that. One thing is clear: we cannot allow Russian aggression and Putin to beat us with this long-waged war. War fatigue is a real thing, and I welcome President Biden's commitment today to another £500 million, I think it was, in military aid, and our own commitment from our own Prime Minister and our own government along those lines as well. But some of the other European countries should step up and match that as well. I think it was the member for Woodford Green told us one time that he was in Ukraine about a month ago, and he was saying that there are many soldiers who are suffering from PTSD. The papers referred to that today, so I think maybe I would ask the Minister if there's any more that we can do for those soldiers who are suffering from PTSD, who have maybe war fatigue, because it is a real thing. and as our attention rightly goes to global emergencies such as the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, by the same token, we cannot allow ourselves to be distracted from our commitment to Ukraine. And I trust that the message today from this House is clear. We will not be deterred from helping our allies. We will continue to stand against Putin and all the badness and evil and wickedness that he represents. And that is not all quiet on this Western Front where the battle is. We will be using our voices in this chamber, our munitions from our factories, and our voices to continue to reject the invasion of Ukraine. And just like that great Ukrainian spirit, that courage, that inspiration that they have given us all across the world, we will not be beaten down. We will not give in to this despot. Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you.
Shadow Minister Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The grim reality is war in Europe is no longer in our rear-view mirror. It is now. We are living in a bleak new chapter in the history of Europe, as Putin seeks to destroy the sovereignty of our Ukrainian friends and seeks to attack the principles of democracy that the rules-based world order is built on. As the UK falls silent on Friday morning for a national moment of reflection for Ukraine, we're reminded of the devastating toll that this war has had on the Ukrainian people, the tens of thousands of lives that have been needlessly lost, the families that have been torn apart and displaced from their homes, with over 100,000 of them now here in the UK, the women who have been raped and violated, the children who have been stolen by Russia, and the economic and social fabric of a nation left in tatters. There is the ongoing struggle for peace. It is their fight in Ukraine, but it is also our fight. And yet, despite all the suffering and the horror that Ukraine has endured, the flame of freedom burns bright in Kyiv. Just look at the extraordinary resilience of the Ukrainian people in the face of Russian aggression that we've heard in speeches from both sides of the House today, praising the skill, bravery and fortitude of the Ukrainian military to defend their homeland. And, as we've heard from the former Prime Minister, the incredible and inspiring leadership of President Zelensky. Just under a fortnight ago, members in this House were privileged to hear from President Zelensky in his address to Westminster Hall. His speech moved us all and reminded us what is at stake. Colleagues from across the House have made some extraordinary contributions in this debate, and I'm just saddened that there weren't more of us here to hear what good speeches they have been. To have a debate where we have two former Prime Ministers speak is good. And if I'm honest, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not normal that those two individuals might elicit cross-party support, given the events of the past year. But there has been, I think, in this debate, an extraordinary level of cross-party consensus, a unity that goes across political parties, across nations and across our continent in our support for Ukraine and our determination that Putin must lose. That is a message that Putin hoped there would never be fought, never be shared, because he hoped to fracture the West. He hoped to change what we had here from a united position to one of division where we turn against each other. And that has not happened. Happy giving way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think I'm the oldest person in this chamber. No. By a long way. But I remember the Vietnam War. And the Americans were forced to withdraw from Vietnam by public pressure at home, largely. We haven't talked in this debate about what's happening in Moscow and other parts of Russia, but it must be horrendous with 60,000 dead and huge numbers of them returning with post-traumatic stress disorder, I'm sure. And actually, we have got to put huge effort into getting through to the Russian people to convince them that this war is actually not fair, it's not right, and they should actually put huge pressure on their own governments, their own government, get rid of Putin, actually sort this out, withdraw, and then we, in the end, as the former Prime Minister has suggested, implied, perhaps he'll correct me, we've also got to have a Russia that works and is a decent place for Russians to live, because Russian soldiers are just like our soldiers. They're doing their duty and they don't really have much choice.
Thank you. I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention. You are what you eat, and that is true of food as it is of media that you consume. And when we look to the people of Russia, the media that they are able and allowed to consume is one that tells a very one-sided story, tells a story only from the Putin mouthpiece in the Kremlin. No challenge, no debate. And so how we deal with misinformation, how we deal with the deliberate calculation to deny the truth from his own people is quite a challenge. And that is something that we must address in terms of information operations and those parts of how we tell a story. One of the pieces that the BBC World Service was so good at. That's something, a purpose for them now. Madam Deputy Speaker, in this debate we have heard about the complacency that the UK has had from Russian gas, from the former Prime Minister, the member for South West Norfolk, who's sadly not in her place at the moment. But we've also heard from both sides of the House about how the Wagner Group should be listed as a terrorist organisation. Because they're not just a sponsor of terrorism, they are the terrorism. And if we don't act now, we will be repeating the mistakes of the past. Because as we have seen, we are looking in a rearview mirror to comment on what has happened to look forwards. We've seen what the Wagner Group has done in Syria. We're seeing what they're doing in Ukraine. And as my honourable friend from Slough said in his intervention, we can see what they could potentially be doing in Africa as well. So let's hurry up and make that decision. Madam Deputy Speaker, Putin's criminal invasion of Ukraine is appalling. It's brutal and unjust. Putin displays contempt for international institutions, humanitarian laws and the rules of military conflict. But above all, Putin has shown a callous disregard for human life, Ukrainian and Russian. He treats human life as nothing more than pawns to satisfy his monstrous ambition. And that is why the Leader of the Opposition has said clearly that Putin should stand trial in The Hague for his crimes at a special tribunal. As we know, Putin's aim is not simply to take Ukraine. We are facing a tyrant who wants to use his war to redraw the map of Europe. He wants to destroy the unity of the West. And 1 year on, as the former Prime Minister of Uxbridge and South Wales has said, there is still no sign that any of Putin's strategic aims have changed, nor have they been achieved. But this war can only end in failure for Putin. He will fail because he has miscalculated the incredible resolve of the Ukrainian people to defend their homeland. He will fail because he has underestimated the strength of resolve on these shores and across the West to support Ukraine for as long as it takes to defeat Russia. And he will fail because the millions of voices defending democracy will, over time, drown out the hate and division of tyrants and dictators. Madam Deputy Speaker, the government has had Labour's fullest support on Britain's military help to Ukraine. And as my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, said on his visit to Kyiv only a few days ago, for as long as Putin continues to wage this criminal war, the government will continue to have Labour's fullest support. But as we head into the second year of this conflict, there are a number of important questions that I'd like to press the Minister on. Happy to.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does he agree with me that rather than the Ministry of Defence selling off 1,105 vehicles last year, either to authoritarian regimes or auctioning them to private arms dealers, that these should be donated to Ukraine to support their resistance?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention. I think it is really important that when we look at military disposals, we look carefully at where that equipment goes. But what I would say is there has been good support for Ukraine so far, but we'd like that support to go further. And that's indeed, I think, is the point that she is trying to make at that point there. As my friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, said, while 25 NATO nations have rebooted defence plans since the start of the invasion, the UK government has yet to do so, despite Labour arguing for ministers to reboot defence plans since last March. In next month's review of the integrated review and the spring budget, the government must take the opportunity to move on from these ad hoc announcements and set out a more systematic support approach for Ukraine. So when the Minister gets to his feet, can he confirm when the government will set out a full 2023 action plan for military, economic and diplomatic support to help give Ukraine confidence in a sustained stream of future supplies, as Labour has consistently argued for? And can he also say whether now is still the right time, as he suggests, for the government to proceed with cuts to our armed forces before the integrated review reports? And can the Minister also reflect on calls from both sides of this House to restrict the Wagner Group? My right honourable friend from Birmingham Hodge Hill set it out very clearly when he set the objective of suffocating the Wagner Group and closing the sanctions loopholes. There is cross-party support for that, and I encourage the Minister to get on with it. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to briefly turn to stockpiles because it's been raised by members from both sides of the House. On this side, we welcome the £2.3 billion the government has allocated to Ukraine last year and this year, and the £560 million to fill some of the empty stockpiles. But we need to be clear, it's not enough. There is an immediate need to replenish our own stockpiles, which have been depleted in supporting Ukraine, and to date the government has acted too slowly to replenish them. Members in Slough, Angus and New Forest East have made that point quite clearly in this debate. There is now a growing need to set out a clear stockpile strategy to sustain support for Ukraine and rearm Britain in the long term. That's a clear strategy, working with industry, allowing them to invest with a certainty of what can come out of it, because we need to be certain to our friends in Ukraine that when we make a pledge that we will support them, that we have the industrial capability to honour that promise, something that has been said from both sides of the House. The NLAW anti-tank missile, for example, which has been vital to Ukraine, took 287 days since the latest invasion before the MOD got its act together and signed a new contract. But the first new NLAW won't come off the production line until 2024. We need to shift parts of our defence industry and the Ministry of Defence procurement to an urgent operational footing, both to support Ukraine and to rebuild UK stocks for any future conflict. So can the Minister set out how long it will take our armed forces and our industry partners to replenish UK stockpiles to ensure we can defend our own shores while honouring our commitments to Ukraine and NATO? And if the UK is to be the first nation to send long-range missiles to Ukraine, as the Prime Minister stated in Munich, then by what date will they be sent? And assuming they are the Storm Shadow missiles, how will they be replaced and what is the plan? And what plans is this department making to urgently ramp up our own industry so we're left better equipped to deal with future conflicts? The government has far too often raided the stockpile to make efficiency savings. That is a mistake that has come home to roost now, and we need to not repeat that again. Madam Deputy Speaker, Russia is not a spent force. In spite of the huge damage Ukraine has inflicted on its military, the spring offensive that is now perhaps only days and weeks away will see Russia massively expand its war effort. It is conscripting more people, and although it is sending them into a bloodbath that few of them will survive against high-end Western weaponry, this war could continue for a very long time. NATO Secretary-General has said only last week that we are seeing the start of a new Russian offensive already. So in order to support Kyiv with this new spring offensive, can the Minister update the House whether the UK is on track to send the 14 Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine and how they will be supported in field? I think it would be much easier for the Minister if he were just able to agree to set out a long-term plan rather than ad hoc announcements. I want to pay tribute to all those people across the United Kingdom who have welcomed Ukrainian refugees into their homes, who have fundraised for them, who have gone the extra mile to deliver supplies and aid to our friends in the Ukraine themselves. This has been a huge undertaking. And I also want to thank the officials in the Home Office who have helped facilitate the Homes for Ukraine scheme, as well as colleagues in the Department for Levelling Up. But we need to recognise there are holes in those schemes now that need to be filled. That is not a partisan critique, that is just making something work properly. We do need that to be looked at properly to make sure that if this war continues, as I fear it may do, the support we can offer those people who have fled war can be consistent and long-lasting as well. Madam Deputy Speaker, the invasion of Ukraine did not start a year ago. It started 9 years ago. And we must learn the lessons from how we were complacent at that time, how the West was sleeping, how we gave a dictator and a tyrant in the Kremlin effectively the green light by not taking stronger action. The UK must be prepared to support Ukraine for the long term, renewing our resolve in confronting Russian threats, pursuing Putin's war crimes and standing with Ukraine. Should there be a change of government at the next general election, it is important to say there will be no change in Britain's position of support for Ukraine. Madam Deputy Speaker, never again is a phrase said too often in this House. But never again is now. We must rise to the same heights as our Ukrainian friends to ensure that Putin loses and Ukraine wins. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, we've had a serious, sombre but spirited debate today, as befits the subject at hand, and there have been many powerful speeches, including from two former Prime Ministers, no less, and I will touch on a number of them in due course. But let me begin by noting a clear and overriding message that emerges from our deliberations, and that is the solidarity from all sides of this House for our Ukrainian friends. Their sheer, bloody-minded defiance in the face of unprovoked and brutal aggression has moved and inspired us all. And it is indeed unprovoked and brutal aggression. History is littered with examples of conflicts where, in truth, it's far from clear which side has the better claim to the moral high ground. The issues are murky, facts are contested, arguments cut both ways. This is not such a conflict. Putin's actions, invading a sovereign country at peace with its neighbours and which pose no threat, are self-evidently morally bankrupt. They lack even a shred of justification. Indeed, Putin's pretext, namely that the Jewish Ukrainian president was somehow a fascist, is as preposterous as it is desperate. No, the Kremlin's invasion is depraved, cruel, unnecessary and illegal. It is a war of choice that has brought needless death and destruction. It has taken thousands of lives and wrecked countless more. And it has brought appalling suffering to innocent people, including countless children. The world knows it. Ukraine knows it. Vladimir Putin knows it. Madam Deputy Speaker, this debate has a special poignancy, coming as it does so close to the one-year point from the full-scale invasion. But until that first missile was launched into Ukraine, many in truth doubted Putin's illegal full-scale invasion would actually happen. Surely this was just sabre-rattling, they thought. But it's important, Madam Deputy Speaker, to note that it was this country, under the leadership of my right honourable friend, the right honourable member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, who, working with the United States, exposed a cynical Kremlin plan for a false flag attack involving planted fragments of UAVs and staged casualties in Russian-occupied territory to set up the phony pretext for an invasion. And on the 17th of February, the Ministry of Defence published the first defence intelligence showing Putin's planned invasion routes, just as the Russian president was denying harbouring any such intention. And indeed, by the date of that full-scale invasion, 22,000 Ukrainian service personnel had already been trained by British soldiers across land, across sea and in the air. Weapons and ammunition, including the now famous NLAWs, made here in the UK, were already in the hands of the Ukrainian army, ready to defend that country from the onslaught to come. Indeed, the United Kingdom was the first European country to provide lethal defensive aid. And how the Ukrainians used it. In those vital first few weeks, they used it to hold back the Russian flood. Russian soldiers who packed special uniforms for the expected victory parade were stopped in their tracks and instead were harried with an intensity and bravery that stunned the world. It was a feat of arms against overwhelming odds that takes its place in history. And then, of course, the Russian forces were pushed back in a great sweeping retreat, forced into a gruesome drive-by past the scene of their many crimes, not least Bucha, a name destined to forever stain the conscience of the Kremlin. Russian forces have now abandoned all territory west of the Dnieper River. At day 361, Russian forces are still not where they expected to be on day 3. Meanwhile, the combat effectiveness of their army has been reduced by 40%. Nearly two-thirds of their modern tanks have been destroyed or disabled. Indeed, Putin's campaign appears to have failed to meet any of its operational and strategic objectives, while Ukraine has managed to wrestle back more than half of its stolen territory. Because despite all the bombast, despite the continual indiscriminate assaults on civilians and civilian infrastructure, despite the repeated human wave attacks with young men used as cannon fodder, Russia continues to fail. A little over a week and a half ago, a Russian brigade attacking Vuhledar was completely wiped out, losing more than 1,000 people in 2 days. Those figures must be added to the thousands and thousands that have gone before. The Russian military has suffered up to 200,000 casualties, including between 45 and 60,000 dead. The blood price of a perverse and ahistorical nationalist fantasy. Meanwhile, Putin breaks his army on the anvil of Ukrainian resistance. Ukrainians are displaced, towns have been razed to the ground, and there are credible reports of rapes and the forced deportation of thousands of children. And there were those harrowing accounts which were relayed by the Honourable Member for Bradford South. Don't forget us, she reminded some had said. Well, we won't. Because those responsible for these unspeakable acts will have to answer for them. Indeed, my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice and Security for the Netherlands, will be hosting the Joint Ministerial Council in March to support the vital work of the Office of the Prosecutor and the International Criminal Court. And the Honourable Gentleman for Strangford was right when he referred to the systematic cruelty. Let that be exposed. Let those crimes be brought to justice. Let people pay for the cruelty and illegality they have perpetrated. Because just as time and again Russia has reckoned without the courage, tenacity and indeed ingenuity of the Ukrainian people, so too did Russia underestimate the resolve and unity of the international community. I will.
Would he agree with me that when Putin cowardly invaded Ukraine, he thought the West would look the other way? A year on, he's probably deluded in believing that we would be apathetic over time to the support for Ukraine. And what this debate today and what the minute's silence on Friday will show is that we will never give up Slava Ukraine.
The Honourable Gentleman puts the points extremely well, and I can't improve on them, because he's right. Today, NATO is stronger than ever. And by the way, it's not just NATO. We shouldn't fall into the trap of assuming it's NATO. What about Australia, who is providing support to the Ukrainians? What about New Zealand troops, who here in the UK are helping to train the Ukrainians? So let's not give in to that Putin-esque rhetoric and narrative. This is the world community coming together. But it is a fact that NATO is set to grow with the accession of Sweden and Finland. And the UK alone has sanctioned almost 1,300 individuals and over 130 entities since the start of the invasion. Other countries have acted decisively too. And on this issue of the Wagner Group, let me say we have sanctioned both the Wagner Group. We've sanctioned Yevgeny Prigozhin. We've sanctioned his family. We've sanctioned Dmitry Utkin. Also Arkady Gostyev, the director of the Federal Penitentiary Service of the Russian Federation. I will. Go ahead.
While he's going through his list, would the Minister be good enough just to explain to the House why the Americans have sanctioned 3 times more people associated with the Wagner Group than we have? Simple question.
We have sanctioned the Wagner Group in its entirety. So there really is no place to hide. Yes, we have. And there is no place to hide for those who either aid or abet, counsel or procure the actions of the Wagner Group. And indeed, the UK has been amongst the foremost nations supporting Ukraine politically, militarily, and with humanitarian assistance too. And it is worth just taking a moment to consider what that support actually involves. So this is over 100,000 rounds of ammunition. This is 5,000 anti-tank weapons. And on the point that was made about armoured vehicles, the United Kingdom has provided over 200 armoured fighting vehicles. Some of the so-called dogs of war that saw service in Afghanistan, the Mastiffs, the Ridgehounds, the Wolfhounds, the Ridgebacks and so on. That is what we've done, to say nothing of the winter weather gear, to say nothing of the 2 Sea King helicopters, to say nothing of 3 million rounds of ammunition. All this we do and more. And we do so because we send a message that might is not always right, that the international rules-based order stands for something, and this country will meet aggression where we find it. Last month, the Defence Secretary announced we would be sending Challenger 2 tanks and AS-90 self-propelled guns. As I've indicated, that comes after NLAWs, javelins, brimstone missiles, night vision goggles, medical supplies, winter clothing, and search and rescue helicopters. The training for the tank crews has already begun, and while our armed forces are also putting Ukrainian recruits through their paces in a range of crucial battlefield skills. And I would just share with the House this. There are few more poignant sights, Madam Deputy Speaker, when flying over some of those training grounds and seeing Ukrainian troops beneath you, to see scarred, etched into those fields of the United Kingdom, trenches. And indeed, that is what it has become, trench warfare in parts of our continent. So in 2022, we trained 10,000 new troops. In 2023, we intend to double that number. And as honourable members will also be aware, our armed forces will be training Ukrainian aviators to fly sophisticated NATO standard fighters in the future. We expect to begin training the first Ukrainian pilots this spring. You cannot, of course, supply a jet before you've trained the pilot, and no time is being wasted in that endeavour. And we have committed to match the £2.3 billion in military aid spent last year, and that's why we continue to lead the international military and diplomatic effort too. As we saw with our tank donations, as the Honourable Member for Rayleigh and Wickford indicated, our role can be to have a force multiplier effect. We can catalyse the work of other nations. That's why the Prime Minister signed the London Declaration with President Zelensky, cementing our unwavering commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and urging others to do the same. There is much more I could talk about, but let me just come to this. Mr. Speaker, on Friday, the nation will stand in silence to commemorate a year on from the invasion. As well as His Majesty the King sending his support to Ukraine, over 100 events will take place across Whitehall. This will be an opportunity to remember all those who've lost their lives and all those who've seen their lives irrevocably change. It will be an opportunity to remember all those who continue to fight for their liberty. But it will also be an opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, to redouble our resolve, assuring that when the time comes, that proud nation will build back stronger than before, which is why on the 21st and 22nd of June, the United Kingdom, jointly with Ukraine, will host the International Ukraine Recovery Conference. Madam Deputy Speaker, the signal we are sending to Vladimir Putin couldn't be clearer. He has turned his country into a pariah and the most sanctioned nation on the planet. Meanwhile, the world stands with Ukraine, ready to support that proud and defiant country to defend its territory and its people. 1 year on, with Russia gearing up for a new offensive, Putin remains unrepentant. His only coherent war aims are for more war, more death, and more suffering. His desperate hope is that the world will lose its nerve. It won't. Together we will defy him. Together we will prove him wrong. As President Zelensky told us in his stirring address to the House 2 weeks ago, we know freedom will win, we know Russia will lose, and we really know the victory. The victory will change the world. Slava Ukraini, Geroyam Slava.
The question is that this House has considered the situation in Ukraine. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.